Hey everyone, this is the walkthrough for the sketchbook project for 2D Art Foundations. So to get started, you're going to grab 20 sheets of sketchbook paper. Count this off however you need to. And then what you're going to do is once you have that counted off is you can return any extra papers that you grabbed initially. And then what you're going to start to do is begin the folding process for these. Sometimes I have students that try to do these kind of all in one or two goes, and sometimes this can be a little bit of problematic when you get to the binding and creates a little bit more work for yourself. So to save time in the long run, kind of the magic number is about 3 to 5 pieces of paper at a time. And what you're going to do is kind of align the corners, get that held down, and then press towards the middle of your crease. And then for kind of folding up your paper, you can either use one of the bone folders or you just use your fingers as well. Otherwise, it's going to be pretty repetitive with that. Just kind of continuing with those stacks of kind of 3 to 5 sheets of paper, going through folding each group. And I would say with that, just adjust kind of based on what works best for you. And just kind of what maximizes quality and kind of time management for you. Otherwise, once you have kind of all those stacks all together, you're going to have a group of kind of these booklets. These are also called signatures. And what we're going to do is we are going to combine these signatures into one larger one. So you're going to open those up to the middle and then kind of nest them all together so that you have kind of one large booklet of those 20 sheets of paper. You can also do this while you're folding as well, but sometimes it's just easier to get them all folded and then just get them combined at the end as well too. Otherwise, we'll have that one kind of big booklet at the end. And then what we'll do is once we have those pages, we're going to get those set aside and we're going to begin making the covers for the sketchbook. So there's going to be a few different materials. One is going to be, you're going to grab 2 sheets of, it's like a parchment paper, pretty thin. You can kind of see through it where it's almost transparent. We'll use this for part of the drying process. You also grab 2 sheets. It's this heavier kind of beige cardstock. These will be kind of the covers or the kind of cover paper for our book board. You also grab 2 pieces of book board. For most of our classes, we end up using a recycled mat board. And then last thing you'll grab is going to be 2 end sheets. These are kind of the cover slips that go on the inside covers just to help kind of neaten up and make them look a little bit more professional. Once you get those all grabbed, what you're going to do is you're going to set aside your parchment and your end slips. And what we're going to do is we're going to focus just on the cardstock and the book board. And then as you get those all ready and set out, what you're going to do is you're going to grab a couple other materials. So you're going to get that cardstock and book board laid out. You can either do both covers at the same time. Otherwise, what you can do as well is kind of work on one and then move over to the other. So you're going to grab out some glue. They'll be in these kind of clear containers. And then they're usually about halfway to 3/4 filled. And then you'll also grab a paintbrush. For the book board, usually either side works out just fine for applying it. What we typically want to do is instead of applying glue to the paper or to the cardstock, we want to apply as much of the glue as we can to the mat board or the book board. Reason for that is with paper products, anytime you introduce moisture, you have the paper filaments kind of wanting to go back to their natural state. With paper, since it's a thinner material, the kind of flex with that ends up being a lot greater because it has a thinner surface. Whereas with book board, since you have all those paper filaments all together, they end up compressing each other and kind of minimizes some of that bending or warping that happens with glue. So anytime you can, make sure that you're applying glue to the board itself. Otherwise, for kind of that first application, you're just going to apply glue to the kind of one side of your book board. Once you have that fully coated, should just be kind of a nice thin, even layer. You're going to get that flipped around, and then you're going to attach it to your cardstock. Kind of the big thing to keep in mind is just try to get that as kind of centered as possible on your cardstock. It'll help with just kind of the overall look and appearance, and then also help with some of the later bits of gluing. So just try to get that as centered as you can. Kind of go over once over with your hands, just getting that pressed down. And then what we're going to start to do is get this prepped for trimming the kind of excess paper on the corners, and then begin the process of getting this ready to get folded up and around to cover those sides of our book board. You have two options as far as cutting. You can either grab a pair of scissors or a box cutter. I prefer the box cutters. I just feel like they end up getting a little bit more exact for my taste. That being said, if you'd prefer to use scissors, that's more than fine. Otherwise, what you're going to do is you're going to trim off at about a 45-degree angle the excess kind of paper at the corners of your cardstock. This is just going to help minimize some of the excess folding or excess paper that you'll see in those corners. And then you'll notice that as I'm getting those trimmed down, I'm not going right to the corner of my book board. I'm leaving about almost like 1/8 to 1/4 inch excess. And what this does is just helps kind of hug up on the very corner so that that's not exposed when we have that all folded together. So then once I have those trimmed down, what I'm going to do then is I'm going to use the kind of natural edges of my book board to assist with that folding. So what I'm going to do is kind of press down an edge, and then I'm going to use that edge as almost like a hinge to create almost like a natural fold or indentation in my cardstock. Just helps give a really nice clean edge, makes it just a little bit easier and quicker than doing it by hand. And then once you have that kind of all hinged around, you're going to begin that process of gluing those little bits of side pieces over to the back sides. Typically what I'll do is I'm going to start with those two thinner pieces initially, because then those larger pieces will help hold everything down. And what I'm going to do is just kind of do an initial press down where I'm starting to just get some of that glue on that paper to get it tacked up. And then what I'm going to do is take one of those bone folders that we used earlier for folding up our pages to press down and really kind of cement that edge and that book board together. And I'm going to do the same thing with those other two sides, kind of doing a thin layer of glue around the edge of my book board. I'm going to do a kind of an initial press down with my fingers, and then going back in with a bone folder to really kind of burnish in that paper to the book board with the glue. Sometimes you'll get a little bit of excess glue that kind of comes off on the bone folder. You can just feel free kind of just get that smudged off in the middle, because we can utilize that later. And then last step that we're going to do with this cover is we're going to get that end slip glued on to that inside. So it's kind of the same process that we did with a cardstock. Instead of gluing with the paper itself, you're going to glue on the book board. Kind of same process, nice thin even coat of glue. And then with this one, I'm typically kind of avoiding those very edges where I'm going to have the exposed paper. If you get a little bit over, that's fine, and we'll talk through that process. Otherwise, once you have kind of that nice thin layer of glue, you're going to press down your end slip. Same thing as with the cardstock, making sure that it's nice and centered. And then what you'll do at this point is we're going to start to get it ready for drying. So one thing to do is if you're noticing any kind of excess glue on your edges or your corners, get that wiped off with a paper towel. And then what we're going to do is get this labeled, because when all of these are made all together as a class, we're going to end up with a bunch of these that all look pretty identical. So you want to make sure that they are labeled with your name. So you're going to write your first and last name is great. If you'd prefer to do your initials or just first name, just last name. Any variation should work. And then I would also like you to include the period so that as we get these sorted through and as you're looking for them, it just makes it easier for you to find yours. It also helps me so that if it does go missing, I can better assist you in getting those found and figure out where they went. Once you have those labeled, just kind of do a double check. If you have any kind of extra big gloops or kind of big runny areas of glue, get those wiped off. And then what we're going to do is you're going to take the last sheet of paper that you grabbed, that parchment paper. You're not going to do any gluing down, but what we're going to do is just use this as a way to separate these sketchbook covers from one another. And it just helps kind of minimize any of that sticking together so that when we come back tomorrow, that is not going to be an issue for you. And then what you're going to do is you're going to bring that cover and that parchment paper to the area to get those weighted down, either with a book or with one of the book weights. And then you are going to do kind of that same process with the second cover. So this is kind of a good time to reset. So you're still going to be using the glue if you have any kind of scrap pieces of paper. This is a good time to kind of get those recycled, get your area cleaned up. Otherwise, it's going to be kind of that same process all over again for the second cover. So you're going to do that thin kind of layer of glue on the book board, get that centered and press down onto your cardstock. Get your corners trimmed down. Using the edge of the book board as a hinge, you're going to kind of indent your edges and your sides. And then you're going to glue those sides around, first kind of pressing down with your fingers and then using the bone folder to really get that pressed down and into place. And then same process with the second end slip, kind of a nice thin layer of glue, getting that kind of full coverage except for right on the very edges. And then once you have that all glued in place, you're going to get that placed nice and centered on your inside. Get it pressed down with your hands. And then same as with the first one, make sure that you're getting that labeled with your name and the hour. And same as with the other one, under a piece of parchment and then under one of those book weights. Then last thing is going to be cleanup. So any scrap pieces of paper like those extra corners from your cardstock, make sure those get tossed in the recycling. If you use scissors or one of the box cutters, make sure that gets put back where you found it. With the bone folders, if you did get a considerable amount of glue on it, I'd like you to get it rinsed off and then just dried before you put it back away. For glue, make sure that you get your brush fully cleaned out. Warm water works really great for those brushes, and then just make sure that that glue container is fully sealed and that you're getting that stored upright before you head out today so that it doesn't drip or leak. And then that will be everything. So that moves us on to kind of the second day or second part. And this is going to get us in taking the pages and the covers themselves and bringing that all together. So you're going to grab out those covers from the book weights. You're also going to grab your set of sketchbook papers. And then what you're going to do is you're going to remove the parchment paper from your covers. If you had a little bit of glue tackiness, you might have to be a little bit careful as you peel those off. Otherwise, what you're going to do is you're going to get those set aside and those can be reused. Otherwise, what you're going to do is just check your covers, see how they're looking. And then what you're going to do is kind of decide on the front and back cover. And then next material you're going to grab is going to be duct tape. You're going to grab a length of duct tape that's about 2 times the height of your sketchbook. You're going to get that torn or cut off. And then what I like to do is lay that out sticky side up onto your table. You're going to get one of those sketchbook covers aligned on that duct tape first. You're going to notice that I'm putting about kind of one corner to start, about a 1/2 inch is going on that duct tape. And then same thing with the other one. And then I'm leaving about a 1/2 inch gap in between those two. This is going to create kind of the spine of my sketchbook later on. And then what I'm going to do is once I have that gap, I'm going to get that pulled nice and taut. I'm going to press down that excess tape that's going around the inside. And then I'm going to do that same thing with the other side. So I have it kind of completely sandwiched around and have that duct tape kind of fully encapsulating those two covers and then creating that nice kind of middle spine portion where my pages are going to sit. Once I'm happy with that spine, I'm going to grab out my pages. I'm going to get those all aligned so it's nice and centered. The crease of my sketchbook pages is right along that spine. And then using two of the bulldog clips, I'm going to get those pages held down. Reason I'm doing this is as I work with the binding, then I don't have anything moving around while I'm working on that drilling and then sewing. And then for the binding itself, you're going to create a series of 5 to 6 binding points. Usually you want to start about an inch in from each side, and you can either lay these out with a pencil or you can also eyeball them as well. I would say either one works out just fine. And I'd say just kind of do what's most comfortable for you. And then what you're going to do is you are going to grab out one of the hand drills, and then one of the cutting mats or cutting boards. Please make sure that you're working on a cutting board for this part just to keep our tables nice and finished looking and not having a bunch of holes drilled in. Otherwise, as far as the hand drills, they're really simple to use. You're just going to hold them down very gently. You don't need to apply any pressure. And then you're just using that mechanism to spin the drill, and then the drill's going to do most of the work for you. You don't need to apply a lot of pressure, and you're just going to drill until you start to feel kind of some resistance give up. And then you can just kind of check as you're drilling to see if you've gone all the way through or if you still need to drill a bit more further through the tape. So you'll notice as I'm doing this, I'm kind of double checking, seeing I'm getting through all through those pages and through the duct tape on the other side, and just going through each of those one at a time. Otherwise, just take it nice and slow, kind of 90-degree angle right above your surface. And drill's going to do most of the work for you. You don't need to apply a ton of pressure. Alrighty, so once you have those holes all drilled, what I like to do is just kind of flip it over one more time, just double check that I did get through the duct tape in all those spots. And then I'm seeing that because I can always go back with the hand drill at this point and then just kind of touch those up if needed. Whereas if I get further along, sometimes it's a little bit more difficult once we have that thread attached. So this is going to bring us to, once we have those binding holes established, we're going to start on the binding and kind of stitching process itself. So you're going to grab out the thread, a chunk of beeswax, one of the binding needles, and then a pair of scissors. For the thread, you're going to grab off a length of thread that's about 5 times the height of your sketchbook. So usually what I'll do is measure off kind of one height, double that up to create 2. So I have 2 lengths, and then with that 2 lengths, I'm going to double that up so that I have 4 times the height of my sketchbook. And then I'll just add on that one additional height so that I have about 5 times the height of my sketchbook. Then what I'm going to do is get any of that extra thread kind of wound up, get it put back away, and then with my thread that I got cut off, I'm going to move over and start to get the thread waxed. Reason we're applying beeswax is it creates a nice kind of finished coat over the thread, makes it a little bit more durable and sturdy with binding, and gives it a lot more kind of endurance to hold that book together. As far as applying the beeswax, usually what I do is start with kind of one side of the thread, hold it down with one of my thumbs, and then using my other hand, I'm going to pull through the thread along the wax so that I get a nice kind of coverage over the thread itself. I'm going to go through and I'm going to wax my thread 3 times just so that I get a nice even coat and coverage, and I'm trying to get as many sides of that piece of thread covered in the wax as I can. 3 seems to be kind of the perfect number where it's not getting too saturated with wax, but then it's also not too thin and then minimizes some of that durability. And you notice I'm kind of pulling almost downward as I'm pulling the thread through. And then just kind of going nice and slowly, getting that kind of end to end pulled through the wax. And then once I have that all done, I'll get the wax put back away. And then I'm going to grab out my needle and then the thread that I just waxed. For threading your needle, this can be a little bit tricky, especially if you haven't worked with sewing before. What I'd recommend is kind of twisting that one end, and then you're almost going to pinch the end, holding the needle pretty close to your thumb and forefinger, and then you're just going to slowly guide it into the eye of your needle, and then you can pull through on the other end. Once I have that threaded, what I'm going to do is I'm going to get those two ends kind of at the end of my thread, and then the eye at the other end, at the almost at the halfway point. And then for knotting up my thread, what I'm going to do is I'm going to wrap that around, creating a loop, using my kind of two fingers, bringing that end through, and then pulling it tight so I have about almost like an inch kind of end at my thread. And then I'm going to do that same thing, double knot my thread, kind of creating a loop, drawing those ends through, and then pulling it tight. And then once I have that double knotted, then I'm going to move over and start to work on the binding process itself. So with my kind of covers, sketchbook pages, and those bulldog clips holding everything in place, for the binding, you can either start on the kind of top or bottom edge. Either one works out just fine. So either kind of that first or last hole we drilled in, you're going to start from the inside. So kind of moving from the needle from the inside and then bringing it to the outside. You want to have that knot on the inside, just since we want to maximize some of that durability. And then I'm going to get that pulled nice and tight, get it flipped over, and then I'm going to do almost like in every other kind of in and out stitch. So I'm going to go kind of next hole down, pull my thread through, get it pulled tight, and then move along, get my book flip to the inside, and then I'm going to repeat that same process. So I'm going to go from that second binding hole to the third, go from inside to outside, pull that thread tight, and then going to be that same process all over again. So third to fourth, push through, back to the inside. And then one thing I do want to mention is as you're going through, sometimes what'll happen is sometimes just the thread will catch and it might feel like you've pulled tight. Just make sure that you're double checking. Sometimes what'll happen is you might end up kind of having this loop that's left over. So just kind of always make sure that you're checking back. If you're noticing that, just kind of take that moment, pause, get it pulled tight. What'll happen is if some of those hoops are left, it ends up kind of wiggling the pages away from the binding. It makes it a little bit looser overall, and then isn't always the most fun to work with in the long term. So just make sure that you are getting that pulled nice and tight as you're going through. Just kind of check as you go through, kind of double check each time you kind of pull through those knots, just to make sure everything's nice and tight and you don't have any loose spots. And then once you get to the end or the bottom, usually this is the part where we're going to go back the other way. Sometimes what I'll see students is they'll do kind of this wraparound from the other side. Do not do that. It kind of minimizes some of the stability of the spine. So instead of going around, what you're going to do is you're just going to stitch back to that last stitch. So kind of going from that 6th to 5th hole back on the inside, and then it's going to be that same process all over again. But this time you're kind of filling in those empty binding spots on the inside and outside. So you're almost kind of filling in that dotted line that you're creating with your binding. And then for the last stitch, you're going to go under that knot to the outside, filling in that last kind of binding point. And then what you're going to do at this point is you're going to notice you're going to be finishing up on the outside. We don't want to knot it off on the outside, so what we're going to do is just do a double stitch on either that top or bottom. So you're going to bring your needle and your thread back to the inside, get that pulled nice and tight. And reason why we want to knot it off on the inside is it's just going to create a little bit more stability. Knots are usually kind of the weakest part of your binding, so by having those on the inside, they get a little bit less wear and tear than when they're on the spine. And then once you have that thread and needle on your inside, what you're going to do is you're going to bring your needle under your stitch with your binding. You're going to pull it through to the other side, and you're going to reserve a loop, so you almost kind of have this almost like 4 shape where you have kind of that hoop. You're going to draw your needle through to create a knot, and then what you'll do is you're going to pull that tight. You'll notice that I'm going to drawing it tight along the one side and then drawing up, and then I'm going to do that once more. So bringing my needle under my stitch, reserving that hoop on the one side, bringing my needle through, and then pulling it tight. Once I have that pulled tight, I'm going to start to cut off my needle and my excess thread. You'll notice with mine I end up cutting it about 1/2 inch away from my knots. You can also cut these a little bit closer to your knots as well. You just want to try to keep it about no less than 1/4 inch or so. And then what I'm going to do is just kind of twist off those excess pieces under my binding stitches. The wax will also kind of help hold those together. Otherwise, if you like the look of just having those trimmed a little bit short as well, you can also do that too. And that is it for binding. So then what we're going to do is we don't need our bulldog clips anymore. Binding is holding everything all in place. So we'll get those taken off and then put away. And then other things that you're going to grab is, as you get cleaned up, scissors that you use to trim your thread, make sure that those get put away. If you had your thread, beeswax, or needle out, make sure that they just get put back in their proper spots. And then one thing with your needle is, as you have that excess thread on, unless you have a length that is like, oh, you will like took off way more than you needed, just throw away kind of that extra scrap thread. Make sure that's taken away from your needle, and make sure that you are not tossing the needle itself into the garbage, and then get that put back away in its home. And then as far as your sketchbook, we're going to move on and then start to get that design transferred over to the covers themselves. Something you will notice with your book is the spine is going to be a little bit inflexible at first. This is just because the binding is nice and tight and it has yet to really gain in some of that flexibility of use, so it might sit a little bit open. Couple things you can do. One is you can use book weights to weight that down. The other thing you can do is kind of take your hands and crimp along the spine to ease up some of that tension in the tape in the spine itself, and then it'll slowly start to kind of sit back down so it's a little bit more book-like and not quite so wide open initially. Otherwise, that is all the technical parts for our binding, so you should be good to go. Feel free to rewatch as you need to. Thanks, everybody.